dedicated to the tough truths that we all face in designing for resilience in an uncertain world. So this is really how do we shine a light on those things that maybe we don't love to talk about in industry. Safe space. This is recorded, and it will be all over social. But I think that's part of the intent, right? Like, how do we really elevate the discussion to include those things that are harder to face, right? And in order to move this, move the industry forward, move these initiatives forward within our organization. I'm Paula Fontana. I lead marketing for Lumeter. I've been in and out of the industry really over the course of my entire career, that in ed tech. That's really where I've specialized. But I'm going to hand it over to my panel here. Mark, you want to take a couple minutes to introduce yourself?
Sure. I don't know if I need a couple of minutes. Mark Armour, Senior Director of Global Resilience at Brinks. Been here for 10 years, but I've been in the business continuity and organizational preparedness profession for 22 years. I started in 2002. I'm based in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I am an adaptive business continuity evangelist.
Thank you, Mark. Shane?
Hi, everyone. I'm Shane Matthew. I'm the principal and owner of Stone Risk, which is a boutique consulting firm focused on healthcare and manufacturing resilience practices. And based in Dallas, Texas, the company's named after my son, Stone, who tests my resilience capabilities every day. Nice to see you.
I never knew that.
Yeah. He does test my resilience capabilities every day. It's pretty funny.
I love it. It's fantastic. Joel.
Sure. My name is Joel Navarro. I am the global manager for business continuity and resiliency for Mary Kay, the international cosmetics giant. I have been at Mary Kay for 13 years, building and leading their program. I will just say that I've been in the industry over 20 years. You can do someone can do the math. They go look at my LinkedIn, but certainly I'll
They're
just
all on LinkedIn now.
Yeah, exactly. More than 20 plus. I think that's what I say usually. And so what really interests me, what I like talking about with regards to resiliency is the human piece, the interaction, a lot of soft skills, and then certainly how to build a strong program. So looking forward to the conversation.
Love it. And congratulations on 13 years. That is quite the tenure, especially in today's time. So pretty amazing. Marco.
Hello, Marco Felsberger. Yeah, I'm joining from Europe, Vienna. Thanks for having me. I have been in the industry for almost 20 years, so it's 18 years if you count the military, so depending on that. But yeah, I've been leading the global risk and resilience team of a global logistics company the last 8 years, and very recently joined a new company, Prewave. It's an Austrian tech company. I have to emphasize that because not like in the US, we do not have too many good tech companies here in Austria or in Europe. There are only a few, and I joined as a senior advisor for supply chain resilience. And basically, this is what I've been dealing with the last years with supply chain resilience, how we design robust supply chains, and especially how we can deal with uncertainty in all regards.
Marco speaks a lot about systems thinking and resilience, which I always think is a fascinating intersection of thought. And I'm sure we're going to delve into that here. But before we kick off, just want to lay some ground rules because we are talking about the tough truths, and just make sure that we're going to try to get through as much of this as we can. Of course, our panelists have a lot to share, but we're going to talk a bit about leading through uncertainty. We're talking about the role of risk resilience in that process, and maybe some of the things that we encounter within our organizations, as we look to lead our organizations through change. And then, of course, focusing on the people aspects of that. How do we build more resilient cultures? This is super interactive, so please feel free to engage in the chat. It's always one of my favorite parts of the Lumeter webinars is just how engaging they get. So add your questions, comments in the chat, and we're going to be doing some interactive polling here, and we're actually going to leap right into an interactive poll here to start. But if you want to take out your phones and hop into Menti, I have the code here. All right, so if you pop into Menti, you can scan the QR code with your phone, or go to menti.com and enter the code 41756774. We've got our first question, which is really over to you. What's a tough truth that you've learned in the field? Just to start, and while we're collecting, we'll go back to that as people think about that. And it's a little bit of a challenge because you have to capture it in a few words because it's a word cloud. But while everyone is answering that, just curious about and actually I pulled some data from having a technical problem here. I pulled some data. Actually, this is from Control Risks. This is their top risks map that they launched earlier this year, and was immediately apparent. And we were talking about the meaning behind some of these colors on the map. But what's immediately apparent is that there's been no shortage of risk, no shortage of disruption for a sustained period of time. But Mark, just to kick us off, like, how do you see this really evidencing itself in your organizations and the organizations that you work with?
I think it just reflected the fact that there's hardly anywhere in the world that you can go where you're not faced with some degree of uncertainty and certainly a high degree of risk. And I think as parts of this map indicate, that risk and that uncertainty is only increasing.
Jane, what do you think some of the biggest challenges facing companies right now are?
I think the biggest challenge is money. There is a lot of, and this is coming from my experience recently with, consulting clients, but also in the fact that I worked in the corporate environment and was laid off last year. The challenge right now there's a variety of monetary issues. Companies are facing increased costs, inflation in the United States and throughout the world. And so beyond the geopolitical risks, there's also this challenge of trying to navigate your business priorities and keep them afloat. And then also in that weighing, where do you prioritize your resources? And so I think the biggest challenge is money, but to business continuity practitioners, it's maintaining relevance and importance when your company is facing, fiscal challenges.
What would you add, Joel?
What I thought of when I look at this map is first to recognize, I think this map just shows, risk is everywhere. No matter how much you are spending on mitigation, it exists, right? There's always, teams that are great in defense always get scored on, right? Like that's how it works. So when I look at the map, I kind of think about opportunity. It's like, hopefully we'll get into a little bit of a topic later on, but it's sort of like, even if you felt like you've done everything possible to sort of mitigate the risk or avoid or transfer whatever your risk strategy is, you still have to consider, well, what happens if something does get through? What happens? And so for us as resiliency planners, that's our opportunity to talk about how well are we prepared from a recoverability standpoint, right? So we know something's going to happen, right? We can protect against a lot of things, but something's going to happen and we have to be ready to step up. So sometimes I feel like we're competing for those dollars that Shane's talking about, like risk mitigation versus being ready for the recoverability part, or the inevitability that one of those threats is going to get through, and you need to be prepared to respond to that. So really, I when I see the map, I just think it's just a world of opportunity for resiliency planners.
I love that. Positive thinking.
That's me.
Marco, you're on the other side of the pond here. I'm just curious about, when you look at this map, what does it say to you? And what are some of the challenges you're seeing with the organizations that you serve?
I'll second that. And usually Austria is the small green point you can barely see in the middle of Europe. That's the lucky situation. We are in Austria and Switzerland, but this is of course of course not true. It takes us only sometimes a bit longer to realize that we are exposed to all the risks as well, because that's the interesting part, that interconnected systems, as Shane and everyone said before, you can plan only so far ahead, and then at some point the risks will reach you because they're interconnected. Inflation is triggering politics is triggering geopolitics, and at the end you have a crowd and riot control situation in your country, and you do not even know how this happened. Yeah, this is why it's so important to do not get eluded by the colors alone, yeah, but to draw the connections as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're interconnected today in a way that we hadn't been in the past. It's definitely is something to think about, particularly as we think about how do we evolve the way that we manage risk. There's no such thing as a silo anymore, right? Like, how do we really break down some of those barriers to discovering how we're interdependent and how we can work together to build a more resilient ecosystem in a lot of ways. So this is interesting. What's a tough truth you learned in the field? And lots of great responses here. Plans never go to plan, keeping people engaged, regulations, leadership support, ops trumps most business continuity plans, realistic expectations. I mean, I think a lot of this is really around the intersection of people and operations.
Yeah, I like that, Paula. I was just gonna say, I'm looking at all these things, and it's like people, soft skills. No one said, oh, what does my risk assessment or my BI look like, or the format of my plans, right? It's people.
Absolutely. That could be one of the most nebulous aspects of our job. Does anybody have a case study that they want to share around, or story that they want to share around, how they've been able to overcome some of these people-related issues?
I don't know if I have a story or an anecdote, but I always encourage people start with building relationships. So traditionally, we tend to go in and we develop our workplace or professional relationships asking for stuff. We only engage people when we need something, either we need a decision or we're asking for something. But if we go in from the start and say, I'm going to build a relationship with this person, it makes it easier when you do have to go back and ask for something, as well as when something occurs and you're dealing with people you've already developed a relationship with. It makes it a heck of a lot easier than when you're trying to introduce yourself in the middle of that crisis or that disaster.
Paul, I would also add that building relationships with more than one person is probably a good idea too. I'm not saying that's what Mark was advocating for, but in my experience, I've been in two organizations as the corporate leader, and in both situations, a key leader that was the executive sponsor, the big reason for the program continuing forward and getting the resources it needed, left. And in both cases, within 6 months to 8 months, the program started to wither on the vine, and there really wasn't any other leadership support around it. So gaining experience or gaining partnership with leaders in a variety of different spots, not just your direct leader or leaders in different areas of the organization, up and down, is vitally important. I mean, that's why that stat about the board recognizing its value, I've been in that same situation where there's been board pressure to do something, but that didn't stop the program from getting cut. And so it cannot just be one or two people. It has to be all over the place.
Absolutely. I think, that's a key facet of our role, is really building those relationships across the organization, both up and down and side to side and outside the organization, so that you have that robust support irrespective of whatever changes happen within the organization, and are able to really keep that program moving forward. This was really interesting. So Gartner ran a webinar series this week, and I found it to be exceptionally valuable in terms of just some of the data and the insights that they shared. And I shared some of this out on LinkedIn. And this, I felt in particular, told a really interesting story about how our current ways of doing things are falling apart in a way, right? And so the story this is telling, you look at some of these stats around, they interviewed risk leaders and they found that, 74% were lacking confidence in the data that they had around risk drivers, 68% lack confidence on their risk impacts, and 86% lack confidence in their control effectiveness. And then they sort of turned the conversation around and they asked those that were participating in these risk assessments, and they said, well, you know what, only 1 in 25 really felt like they were in a position where they could answer truthfully and that they were being sufficiently provoked, meaning adequately challenged to really surface those vulnerabilities and things that needed to be discussed. And I think this is just such a telling statistic about, and it dovetails with what you just talked about, Shane, in terms of how do we build relationships? How do we build deep relationships with people really across the organization, which is a really tough thing to do. Another thing that's not on the slide, but the number one reason why people didn't divulge information about key risks was because they were not asked. They were never asked. So don't assume that people are going to come to you. Like you say, taking that proactive step of building relationships with key people across the firm is a really important aspect of what we're doing.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that's the challenge with risk management is that it tends, and not every case, but it tends to stay at a higher level of thought. So you're looking at enterprise-wide risk, right? You're looking at global issues. Whereas I've found that, the risks identified within processes or, by simply walking around and talking to different partners or operational groups within the organization yields practical and tangible risks that you can resolve, right? So like you could say geopolitical risks are big. Okay, yes, I agree, but you're not going to solve geopolitical risks throughout the world from your company and from your seat there in the office. But you can solve problems that are immediately going to impact your business organization. And so there's been so many times, I'll give you one example. I literally walked into a customer service area one time in an organization I worked with and found a computer that was a laptop sitting on a desk. And I asked the question, what's this for? And it yielded a result of this has an access database that controls most of our customer service processes. And so then I asked the second question, is it backed up? And they said, it hasn't been touched. It's been sitting there for the last 2 years since they put it in. So there was no updates, no backups, nothing on this one laptop. And we resolved the situation. I got it transferred into our servers, backed up daily, et cetera. And that story resonated far more than any other thing I did. People remember that particular event more than any other thing. All the BIAs, all the plans I wrote, nothing. They brought up that story consistently. So what I'm saying is like the risk management awareness can come from these small little fixes. And I think we don't spend enough time doing that.
Yeah, that's an important point that you just made around the power of storytelling. I think to draw a finer point as to why this is so critical. I know you talked a lot about that in your Game Changers piece, which I think was like a year ago. But I think you in that piece you drew out the importance of humor. You talked about storytelling. You talked about entertainment. Like how do you really engage people in the process in a way that like really meets them where they are and really translates what we do as a profession, and it makes that connection with the work that they're driving in the organization.
I was going to just mention real quick, Paul, something you brought up about people feeling comfortable to say what the truth was. I mean, that it's one of my favorite topics to talk about it all the time. It's really difficult to be authentic in your vulnerability about where you are as a planner and where your program sits, right? I'm sure these other guys can certainly talk more. I know Mark can certainly talk more about like metrics and the things that you can actually measure that are, not overly complicated, right? They're real metrics for capabilities, but then being able to share those. It's like I said, it's really tough to be vulnerable to, if you're stepping into a position for the first time or you've been there a while and things are not where you think they should be, having to present that in a way that, is not throwing you under the bus, but is certainly saying, hey, listen, I need to let the leaders of my organization know. The other flip side of that vulnerability is I think there is a real difficulty in having to accept, for those of us working in an organization for other people, that sometimes those are the people that are making the decisions on behalf of the organization, and accepting what they've accepted sometimes is really difficult as well. You think we can do more and you should be doing more. But if they're really saying that's it, that's the extent of where I think we should be, and they're the chief risk officer or the chief technology officer, it, again, is really difficult. But you almost in certain ways have to accept that risk of yourself, right? And say that is what they are deciding. They're the ones that are really getting paid to make those decisions. So, where I sit and will work that I do is valued, but it may have reached at least a temporary stopping point, right?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we were talking about before we opened up the webinar was the fact that, things aren't generally as put together as we all like to think they are. That's true of any organization. We kind of put on our best face, for the world, but the reality is there's a lot of piecing together with, paper clips and twine, and, that's ultimately how the world runs. I think it's what we've all realized over the last several years. But one of the areas that I know we've found at Illuminar, particularly as we've explored the arena of emerging risk, has been really challenging teams to think about, well, maybe, just because you have been able to operate successfully in the past, despite all of the vulnerabilities and issues that exist in the firm, that may not necessarily be true in the future. And so this kind of dovetails to the whole concept of leading in fast-paced change. How do you get teams to be open to the idea of transformation and kind of looking beyond the status quo? And this is true of both from a growth perspective, but also from a defensive perspective. Like, how do you convince them that, the old ways just aren't the right way anymore? Mark, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this.
I do. So I don't know if it's our job to convince people otherwise. If we're looking to bring teams along a transformation journey, I think there's two pieces that are really critical. I think first is explaining the why, right? Mm-hmm. If you're going on this journey and you're going down a specific path, what are the benefits to the organization and what's it going to do for us? And that gives people an opportunity to buy in to that, right? And they kind of understand the why behind it. But I would also be open to people challenging that why. Putting yourself in a position to kind of defend the direction that you want to go. And this is something that I think probably Joel can talk to, right? That's opening yourself up to a degree of vulnerability and showing people that you're willing to have those difficult conversations in defense of the direction that you want to go. And that, I think the second component is the how. I think it's understandable that people are going to have a difficult time with change and transformation, particularly as you go into an arena or an environment that they're unfamiliar with, because understandably they're fearful that they may fail. This is something that they're not experts in. This is something that they're going to have to learn as well. And yet maybe they, as resilience or business continuity preparedness professionals, they're looked at as the experts. So as much as we can provide training and understanding to people, but also let them know that they are supported, so that as you make that transformation, they shouldn't fear that failure, and they should be willing to go out and same as us as leaders, be vulnerable and be willing to have those difficult conversations, but also know that at the end of the day, they're supported if they stumble in that that journey and that change in direction.
Marco, you talked a bit about this in your Game Changers piece that we just published this week. You're talking about the business ultimately owning the risk. What does that look like?
Yeah, in my experience, and we touched on it previously, when we said that a lot of focus is on the enterprise level, enterprise risk management, and so on and so forth. And I think risk should be managed where the risk is, and on the enterprise level, we should maybe manage strategic risks, and the top management should focus on that. And in the operations, the operational people should manage the risk. I always try to to bring an analogy to the special forces. Every special forces team has a medic within their rows, within the six people they have for a certain mission. And this medic is not the perfect medic. Would not do a surgery with them maybe on a normal occasion, but in this very moment they can stop the bleeding, and they can identify risks, and this is what in my opinion is the only way to deal with this changing dynamic situations we are facing. In the operations teams, there are experts for the operations. They can sense the risks on their levels and are the fastest to act on those risks. And this is why I'm always preaching in the corporations I work for or I've consulted, that this is how we have to make the transition. The risk manager, the resilience manager, however we call it, we would call us, is only there to maybe raise awareness, to help in the transition phase, and then to maybe make some specialized analysis if I have to quantify something, or if I have to do a network analysis, whatever it may be. This is where I then like to support more. But basically, and this is where we had the biggest successes especially in the previous companies, is when the operations approaching me and telling me, look, we have this issue in this country with this and this supplier. These were the first steps we have taken, and would you do anything else? And this was hours after I would usually have been able to provide some insights or whatever it is. And in my point of view, this is the important part, because then we can react properly to these dynamic situations. And another topic I just wanted to emphasize is the role of trust, and it was mentioned here quite some time for the short period of the webinar. And I read a great book from, I think it was Stephen Covey, who wrote back then, trust equals speed, something like that. He wrote that in the sense that that this benefits the business in doing business, but this is of course true when we deal with crisis. If I have established a level of trust with my peers, with my colleagues, then everything is easier. We do not have to think of hidden agendas or whatever there may be. We can just work on solving the issue. That's why that's so very important.
No
The
hidden
speed
agendas. I love that. Go ahead, Mark.
The Speed of Trust. I think that's the name of the
Yeah,
book by Steve.
the speed of trust. Yeah, right.
I love it. Yeah, and it just brought up some additional stats around this problem that we're talking about here. Yeah, I think what I'm hearing from all of you is like it's very much a role of support and empowerment and enablement and engagement, but not necessarily owning the risk or owning the plan or owning the strategy, but really how do you provide the right level of insights and the tool sets that the organization needs to be able to carry that forward. This was interesting. Again, this is from Gartner. They had a toolkit that they released with some of the thought leadership from this week. And some of these statistics, 32% of organizations have a centralized team dedicated to resilience. And only 20% of organizations say resilience is well understood. And I think this is part of the challenge of being in a role where essentially you are supporting the ownership of risk, or you're supporting the ownership of continuity or resilience as it exists in these other roles in the organization. And what's interesting also is that they had covered, what this looks like from an audit and assurance perspective. And what stood out to me was the distinction in how audit thought about resilience versus third-party risk management. If you look at this, they asked about plans to cover organizational resilience and audit activities in the next 12 to 18 months, and 37% said that resilience will definitely be covered in audit activities versus 61% said the same thing about TPRM. Now, TPRM has gotten a ton of press, right? But at the same time, we also know that resilience has gotten increased regulatory attention. Like, I think we're seeing all sorts of things from a cyber and physical security perspective, which is really making this a non-optional activity. Like, as you look at some of these figures, what do you think it is about resilience that makes it particularly challenging for organizations to embrace?
Well, I'll give you an example. Recently, I worked with a biotech firm, and as part of the assessment process, we talked to internal audit because they, obviously have a role in the company. But one of the interesting points coming from that conversation was that when I said, okay, what does the audit plan look like for resilience this year? They said, we don't have any plans. And so I said, why? And she said, well, that's not our job. Our job is to investigate and audit those things that the company says that they're going to do or has a policy describing exactly what we have committed to do. And until that's the case with resilience, there's no incentive for us to go in and try to include this. There's no driver for us to audit this function because right now it's not really stated clearly that we're committing to doing anything. So I found that very interesting because, in our minds, we tend to think I've written a policy, I've written a SOP, we have a stance on business continuity. There's attention in other areas, but that may not always be the case in the perception of these groups. So I think that's something we have to consider as part of a challenge here is that are we really, as a company, saying we're going to do this and committing ourselves to it and therefore have a reason to be, under the scrutiny of internal audit and groups like that? That's something to consider.
So, how would you attribute the disparity
with third-party management? I think there is obviously, like you said, there's an incredible amount of information and availability of focus on these areas. But I think there's also, SLAs and other sort of contractual agreements that really play into the need to audit these groups. Because if we're saying we're committing to provide particular things to another company and we're dependent on third parties to contribute to that overall product, then that obviously brings incredible scrutiny on us, right? So that in turn turns to others. I don't think there's as much scrutiny from the resilience lens, unless you're in a very heavily regulated industry, of course, but there's many people who are not. So that may account for why there's more scrutiny in other areas than in resilience.
You're thinking about the statistics, 20% of organizations say resilience is well understood. We know so much about the organizations that we serve. What makes it so challenging for us to engage our audience?
I was just going to mention when we were talking early on, certainly through Shane's comments as well, is that I think in terms of resiliency, those of us that have been given the responsibility of resiliency, whatever that looks like at your organization, we don't do a great job of marketing ourselves as a support function, right? I think everybody understands, IT, right? They're a support function. They do the HR. They're here to make sure me and the company are taken care of from a people perspective, right? I think these support organizations do a great job of that. I could even almost extend that out to risk, right? Risk management, kind of like Marcus said, it's usually at the very high level strategic thing. So, that's handled by your executive teams, handled by your upper management. People, the regular folks don't hear so much about that. So part of the successes that I think I've had in organizations I've been a part of is because we do sort of focus a little bit on some of those people relationship building type things. They're important to build the foundation. I don't think we do a good job of marketing who we are in terms of the work that we do, the value that we bring. I think sometimes we get a little overwhelmed or hyper concerned about the the nature or the formality in which we're going and doing resiliency in an organization. And we forget that the whole reason we're doing all of that stuff is so that we can be more resilient, right? So that we can be here to support the organization, so we can all continue to get paychecks when something like COVID happens, right? So I think we could, again, we internally, you can talk a lot more about how do you continue to build those relationships, focusing on some people skills, focusing on some marketing. And I don't mean, glossy ads and in your, newsletters and things like that, but some of those things do help. And I think we forget sometimes, as maybe more technically savvy people, we're focused on the process and the procedure, and we forget about the why behind why we're doing it, right? It's really because you're here to support. So even to go back to that word cloud, someone said, executive buy-in or executive support. And I'm like, well, if you don't already have that with what you're working through, then maybe you need to refocus on what it is you put at your top three. Maybe your top three aren't meeting what the strategic goals of the organization are, right? You're not in line with them. That's why they don't necessarily bother with you, because what they are concerned about somehow is not being related to why you're trying to help them with that concern, right? It's more like, oh, well, we just need to get this done because the regulators are going to be in here next week. Okay, well, you can certainly drive a program that way and have some success, but resiliency is not about, I'm going to say something controversial, but resiliency is not necessarily about compliance, right? It's about resiliency and recoverability. And then, you have to run a compliant program, certainly with all the regulations, but there are ways to do that with keeping, your strategic vision being resiliency and support of the organization and their strategic goals.
Yeah, Marcus Vaughn, one of the Luminar co-founders, will talk about how planning is more important than the plan. And Mark, I think that's something that you talk about quite a bit in your thought leadership. But what does that mean? Like so if you're saying that the plan, it's not that it's not relevant, right? That's not that there's no use for it whatsoever. But I think, like, how do you take that forward in a more adaptive and agile way? But what does that mean from an identity perspective if we can't point to, well, I'm responsible for X, right? How do you market yourself more effectively?
I think Shane articulated it well with his story, right? And then Joel talked about it, right? So Joel talked about we're very focused on the process, and I think the reason we maybe lose some degree of confidence or engagement is we're so focused on completing the process and the framework that we're expected to execute against, meaning I need data for a business impact assessment. I need data for risk assessment. I need you to complete a template so that we have a plan that you can execute. And the people we're working with see very limited value in that. Sometimes they rarely even see the results of all of that work that we task them with doing. And I think if we turned that around and instead started asking, as Shane related to his story, asking the questions, what's this for? Asking people, what do you do and where do you experience issues or disruptions? Because, and Shane articulated this really, really well, that's what people are going to remember, right? They're going to remember that one time that you solved a problem for them. And if we started with asking those questions and building those relationships and understanding how we can help people improve their preparedness without going in saying, I need you to complete this, I need you to deliver this to me. We turn that around and say, what can I deliver for you? I think we'll have a much greater degree of success that helps us learn and understand the business better as well. It helps us build more meaningful, more positive relationships. It helps us build that trust that Marco spoke about as well, and puts us in a better position. So, and I think somebody on the panel also mentioned, instead of focusing on what's the end state we want to achieve, focus on where we are now. Paula, you talked about when you look under the hood of many organizations, it's probably not as pretty as it appears to those of us on the outside. And if we can help people see that messiness within their organization and where we can help to either simplify it or address some of the complexity and some of the risks and issues that are inherent in some of that messiness, again, people are going to remember that much better. It's the stories they remember. They're not going to remember that you wrote a 40-page plan 2 years ago.
What
And I-
you're not
At least this
doing-
wouldn't be good memories for the most people.
It's memories that, as Maya Angelou says, they may not remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel.
Yeah, that's a very important quote.
Are you
yeah.
saying there's no like portrait of you in the main atrium of your building right now, Mark, because of all the business continuity work that you did?
As many times I try to hang one, they keep taking it down.
No, but he gets invited to all the parties.
That's
So
true.
we know he's doing a good job.
But yeah, I think it goes back to being part of the machinery that makes the organization run. Yeah, and that's how you communicate value. And just looking at the chat here, James Mitchell makes the point. I think this is going back to one of the prior slides on a resource constrained environment audit may also not be a priority, which I think is also really interesting to think about. Like the people that we serve are also very resource constrained and under all sorts of demands. And so how can you help advance what it is that they're trying to achieve as opposed to what you're after? And actually the slide that we're looking at now sort of speaks to that in terms of the perception versus reality around risk and resilience. And I think, this made headlines a couple of months ago. Lloyd's Bank axed the risk team after and they made comments around them being perceived as a blocker to the momentum of the business. And it's obviously, not to call out any specific organizations, because I think this is something that every organization, does struggle with, like how much investment do I put into some of these activities versus growth activities. I guess going back to, that statement around, we're facing more disruption than I think we've ever seen, at least in our lifetimes, right? What is it that executives need to understand about risk and resilience? And what do risk and resilience teams need to understand about executives, do you think?
So these are interesting headlines because it talks about risks being seen as a blocker. And I think risk management done poorly is a blocker. I think if we look at risk as only something to be mitigated or avoided, we miss the opportunities that exist within risk. And I think for those of us in that space, we have to think in those terms. We're not simply trying to avoid risk. We're trying to find out, well, what are the opportunities that may exist in uncertainty? And the function of risk management really should be to help leaders make informed decisions in the face of risk and uncertainty. The things that we need to understand, probably very much the same thing, right? That taking advantage of the opportunities that exist in uncertainty and in risky environments provide an opportunity for resilience to provide benefit, because if we have greater degrees of resilience within our environments and organizations, we put ourselves in a better position to capitalize on future risks, meaning opportunities, as well as help us better weather when those risks materialize or when the consequences of those risks result in undesirable consequences.
Yeah, I would say for us as resilience professionals, we overlook the fact that executives have an incredible level of confidence in their ability to do ad hoc, on the fly resolution of major disruptions. Mm-hmm. There is an incredible amount of confidence in their ability to handle problems because they handle problems daily, right? So when they look at resilience, they're like, you know what, we handled COVID. This is the thing I hate the most. I've heard this 100 times. We've handled COVID. We got through that. We went through this event or that event, and so therefore, when you come to the table saying, oh my God, the world is about to fall if we don't fix this, this, and this, they look at you with a little bit of skepticism, and also they have that lens of confidence, right? So they feel like they can solve the problems. I remember one time I was warning our executive team about their dependence on, the remote nature of their work. They were all in different places at all times. So having some sort of backup system in place, I advocated for purchasing, a small little battery backup and internet backup for their personal computers at home. And again, they like, we can handle this. We'll just go to Starbucks in the middle of a disaster, was the common thread. And then this happened to one of our executives, and they were doing their calls and conferencing from their Tesla. This is not a commercial for Tesla, but they were in their car plugged in for the whole day. We were doing calls with them in their car. And like what I'm saying is like they're like, I can handle this, but then they just go to these ad hoc solutions. And I think resilience people need to understand that there is that inevitableness you've got to overcome. So how do you overcome that is the big question.
It's funny. I think I mentioned that early on. It's like, I think sometimes we're fighting for those dollars, right? Like what we're talking about versus, the ERM folks versus the business continuity and risk mitigate, risk resiliency folks, right? Like, in terms of, we're trying to do the same thing. To look back at those headlines, I think for me, it's sort of, again, it's just another opportunity. I think a lot of the people, maybe, all those people, those headlines talk about, they were probably checking all the boxes, but they weren't moving the needle on resiliency, right? It was about how you recovered, right? How you did come. And Shane, I agree with you. I hate that response. Oh, well, we made it through COVID, right? We did great. The only caveat that I have is that certainly what I fall back on is that our chief supply chain officer here, who is a great guy, he's done an amazing job for us, but I had been trying to talk with him and his teams for like 3 or 4 years and say, hey, let me help you with resiliency. Let's get plugged in. Here's what we're able to deliver for you. And he was like, yeah, I believe in it. That's great. We're in the middle of a transition right now, so we'll get back to you. And they did that for like 3 or 4 years. And at the beginning of COVID, right before we're about to go into lockdown, we're in a huge VP and chief meeting. And I was invited because I was business continuity, but I'm in the back of the room, and he looked at me straight across the entire room, right across a crowded room. And he said, his first words were, Joel has been asking me about these things for the last 4 years. Here's what we're going to do now that we're in COVID, now we're about to go into lockdown. So, sometimes, yeah, I think it is, it's great if we can get in ahead of time, but sometimes you just have to meet people where they are. Kind of like what Marco said, you got to meet people where they are. He was ready at that time. Okay, then that's when we start, and we try to figure out how to get those things out. And now I don't have any problems getting into his office. If there is something I think I can help him with, he's usually very open to those kinds of things. So sometimes it does take a little something, but yeah, I get that too.
But I think the argument can be made, right, that you having asked him, even though he did that individual never did anything in response to your inquiries, it planted that seed so that when COVID did arise and that person's in that meeting, they probably already started thinking about it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
If it hadn't been for without having been challenged, and they might have gone to that meeting with blank slate and deer in the headlights. So, and then even to Shane's point is, conducting those calls from a Tesla. Part of those are strengths that we can leverage. I think I look at the benefit we provide is strengthening those capabilities. So rather than saying we should do it differently or we shouldn't do it this way, we say, you know what? Those are great capabilities we can utilize. How can we bring more people into the conversation to help us make better decisions in light of differing perspectives? What are some other tools or capabilities that we can add to this to make us better and more effective in the future, as well as to maybe reduce the pain that we experienced that last time?
And that's
I
why
think that's one of the tough truth is that many of our breed doesn't provide so much value at all for companies. That's I think if I only focus on ticking the boxes and usually things that get audited are easy to audit. That's how that works. And the big things are missed by audit as well. Many times they catch a lot of them as well. But when I remember the big bankruptcies in the last years here in Europe, they were very well audited, at least on the surface. And this all boils down to we do not spend enough time to understand the business models, the revenue streams, how the company is functioning. We often talk about it that we should business enablers, but the risk managers not allowing any risks is like a CFO not allowing to spend any dollar or euro. That's insane. We need to find the right balance. That's the point, I guess.
Yeah, James in the chat talking about never let a crisis or board interest go to waste, which is, we're looking at the slide now. Gartner, the statistic that the board's interest in risk management has surged by 80% in the last year. Of course, relative to other priorities, still not quite there, but I think it speaks to what all of you are saying, right? Like, look at the strategic priorities of the organization, understand how the business works, as we all do, understand how you make money, and then speak in the language of the business. And really seeing that what you do in that context and really what it is that your constituents are trying to achieve. I want to ask a question about what is the one thing that we don't talk about enough in industry, do you think?
I have a hard time deciding between two. One, and I think Joel or Shane mentioned this at the very top, which is soft skills. We don't talk about things like just basic skills, active listening, relationship building, collaboration and communication. And other thing that I think we really need to start getting better at in this space is understanding complexity and uncertainty, understanding things like Cynefin and the Cynefin framework, decision science, wicked problems, things of that nature.
Of course, Mark always steals my thunder, right, in these things. But I would emphasize those 2 points because again, that's where I found the most success. That's what I speak on the most about is those soft skills, that business relationships, right? James Mitchell is speaking my language in chat. He said, don't be the department of no, sort of figure out how to say yes. That's been my go-to, right? Sometimes I'll say yes when I am like, that is not going to work, or I don't think that's, so you figure out those kinds of things and you do that. And then the second thing for me, again, is still around people, not necessarily soft skills, but around people is, Mark and I gave a presentation about this. I'll go back to it because it kind of came up in a presentation I gave earlier this year, is about you got to step outside of your comfort zone, right? You need to build with positivity. You talk about yeses and try to figure out how to say yes as opposed to no, but you got to step out of you have to set yourself vulnerable. You're going to have to figure out where your gaps, where your vulnerabilities are. And you're gonna need to like blast those, or like you need people to know. Now, granted, you can't blast everything and you can't go outside the organization, but to your leadership team, you ought to be like standing on a mountain and saying, hey, these are where the gaps exist, not in the sky is falling way, because I think that's counterintuitive. I don't think that works. I don't think saying we need business continuity because this could happen tomorrow and this could happen tomorrow. I think that's very short-sighted in how much value it can provide to you. But being vulnerable, right? Saying, hey, listen, I wish we were here. And in fact, maybe you've heard in other presentations that we are there. But what I have found, and here is the metrics or the proof that I have, is here's where we really are. And here's maybe how we can address those gaps. But that vulnerability is tough because, we all need paychecks, or at least I do. I don't want to go and say, oh, all that work that's been done or where we exist today is nothing. We're going to have to start over. It can be a little scary to sort of get out of your comfort zone to do that vulnerability. So those are my 2 things. It really is about people.
I'll add that in my recent experiences, the tough truth for me in the resilience industry has been the amount of programmatic reboots that I've seen, meaning the number of new or programs that restart after being stale or, sunsetted or cut, and then they restart again. And I think the reason why this tends to happen a lot is because our profession tends to put our heads down and try to accomplish the standard tasks of business resiliency. And by the time we get our heads back up and look around, a lot of people have forgotten what we do or are so overwhelmed by the complexity of what we do that they really don't pay attention anymore, or don't care, or don't see results. So I'm probably on the closest of my spectrum in my career to Mark than I've ever been with his approaches. But what I would say is the largest tough truth for me is that we've got to wake up. I mean, leadership support being on that word list at the beginning of this, I've been in the industry now for 18 years, and that's been the same topic of conversation for 18 years. And we've got to wake up and get out of this mindset of thinking that it's going to change if we just keep doing the same stuff.
Welcome to the dark side, Shane. And Paula, where did you find the notes from the last meeting I attended? Right there under collaboration. I
Yes,
recognize.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, this is the glorious mess, right? That we're all in. And I think embracing that and not expecting everything to run according to plan or process or the way that we'd like it to go. I mean, we ran this analysis 18 months ago around, how people prefer to engage around resilience, and people come at this in different ways. And so how do you really approach them in a way that's meaningful to them and really draw their strengths and their abilities and thinking styles into the equation? Marco, what do you think? What is something that we don't talk about enough in industry?
I can only second what was said already. What I always have the feeling is that in our industry, we are hiding behind numbers, and that's why I like the approach of adaptive so much, because it doesn't give you a final risk figure, but it's like a progress, and this is very good. And we have to explain that, and there is no one to blame. We are now here, and tomorrow we are hopefully a bit better than yesterday, and this is absolutely okay, and should be absolutely okay to discuss and there is this saying, if you have a faulty plane, you want the pilot to know about it, about the issues, and this is especially tragic after what happened to the Boeing 737 Max. But that's the point. There is no advantage in hiding where we're not good at, especially in the critical operation parts, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it looks like we're already out of time. But one final lightning round. What simple advice would you have for those, and those of you on the line, please contribute your own advice, but what advice would you have for those dealing with the tough truths in industry?
You're asking us, right?
Yes. See everybody, but you guys are the only ones speaking. So.
I'll go first. I'll go first, and I'll be the shortest. Again, for me, it goes back to that vulnerability, that truth and transparency. I think the more truth and transparency you have in terms of like where we are, so that you can meet people where they're at. Right? You want to know where they are too, right? You don't want to have a false sense when you go talk to somebody and say, "Oh, we're prepared, we're good." You don't usually take that at face value, right? So I think that truth and transparency, it cannot be overstated, and the work that we do is really about really where we are, because then we're responsible for filling those gaps, trying to close those gaps.
Absolutely.
I would say that there's a book by John Cotter called Leading Change, and it establishes kind of 8 steps to transformational change. I think everybody should read that book because it really outlines, there's a lot of parallels that you can apply to business continuity and resilience world, but ultimately you have to recognize that you are leading change by taking a resilience program that historically may have looked at just say, worst case scenario, this happens, we're going to resolve it this way. We're trying to change the perception of people's viewpoint on this to something that's more proactive and more helpful on a day-to-day basis. So that would be something that I would give to anyone starting in this industry, is to start there.
Creating a track record as as a leader or as a manager is, I think, an important step. And as we heard, there is any time as good as now to start building a track record. Be reasonable, show the management and the people around you that you understand their issues, and that you're able to put yourself in their shoes, and then when they are ready, they will come, so to speak. But that's basically what I would suggest.
I like it. This is why I like joining these calls. I get to learn from a lot of really smart people. And I didn't go first because I didn't want to steal Joel's thunder. Yeah, and he already mentioned it. I would say get out of your comfort zone, embrace the uncertainty and the complexity inherent in what we do, and focus on building relationships.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you all. I know I've learned a lot from all of you, not only today, but over the years. And I've been looking forward to this for a really long time. So thank you for joining us today. And thanks everyone for joining us. If you're interested in one thing we didn't touch a whole lot on today was the power of scenarios and bringing some of these tough truths to life. But if you're interested in learning more about how we do that here at Illuminar, go ahead and scan the QR code, or you can find us on our website. But thanks to our panelists, and everybody, enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world, and we will see you soon.